The sky above the city of Etheria had been a bruised purple for 3 days, a persistent, unnatural twilight that left the residents unsettled. It was a city of perpetual motion, a humming labyrinth of glass and steel, where the sun was often an afterthought. But this was different. The air itself felt thick, electric, a precursor to a storm that never broke. Below, in the heart of the city's oldest quarter, St. Jude's Cathedral stood as a testament to a forgotten age, a crumbling relic surrounded by the glittering monuments of modernity. Inside, the dust motes danced in the muted light, filtering through the grimy stained-glass windows, illuminating a lone figure hunched in a pew. Julian adjusted the lens on his camera, the click of the shutter, a whisper in the cavernous silence. He was a journalist, a cynical purveyor of human truths, and his assignment was a puff piece on urban decay. He'd come here to capture the irony of a cathedral outliving its faith, but the strange light had captured his attention more than the architecture. The air was charged with something else, a quiet hum that vibrated in his teeth. He felt a prickle on the back of his neck, a sensation he knew to trust. This was no ordinary storm. As the low hum in the air intensified, the colors of the windows began to glow with a soft inner luminescence, their dull portraits of saints and angels suddenly vibrant. Then a single, impossibly bright pillar of pure light lanced through the dome, casting the rest of the cathedral into deep shadow. Julian froze, his hand trembling as he lowered the camera. He could see figures moving within the light, descending with a terrible, silent grace. These were not the angels of the stained glass, nor were they the ones of ancient myth. They were real, and they were coming down to earth. The figures within the light coalesced into shapes, then into beings of breathtaking beauty. They were slender, impossibly tall, with hair that seemed woven from moonlight and eyes that held a gentle, ancient sorrow. They were barefoot, their simple white garments clinging to their frames like sculpted marble. At the center of their group was a woman, no taller than the others, but radiating a quiet authority that silenced even the terrified gasps of the few onlookers. This was Celeste, and her gaze, when it met Julian's, felt not like a glance but an act of creation. It was a look of immense knowledge and an even vaster exhaustion. Julian, the seasoned journalist who had covered everything from political scandals to civil wars, found his professional composure cracking. His camera, which had felt like an extension of his arm for a decade, now felt like a child's toy. The low hum in the air became a sound, a chorus of voices singing in a language no human could understand, yet every listener knew its meaning. It was a lament, a song of loss and departure. Julian, rooted to the spot, fumbled with his notepad, his mind racing to find a word that could capture the moment. He settled on beautiful, but the word felt thin and insufficient. Celeste descended, her feet touching the worn stone floor with no sound at all. The light that had enveloped her faded, leaving her standing in the cathedral's dim, earthly glow. The silence that followed her arrival was deafening. Her eyes scanned the small group of humans huddled in the pews. A homeless man, an elderly couple, and Julian. She did not look at them with judgment, but with a profound, almost painful empathy. It was then that the first words were spoken. They were not from her, but from a speaker broadcasting from the cathedral's loudspeakers, a voice of authority that had clearly not witnessed what Julian had. Citizens of Etheria, remain calm. This is an unprecedented event, but it is under control. Julian looked down at his camera, the perfect evidence of the chaos that was clearly not under control. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that his puff piece was dead, and in its place was the story of a lifetime, or perhaps the end of the world as he knew it. The government's claim of control was a transparent lie. Outside the cathedral, Etheria descended into a panicked frenzy. Julian could hear the wail of sirens growing closer, the sound a jarring note against the ethereal silence that still clung to the cathedral's interior. He looked from Celeste's serene, tired face to the other angels, who seemed to shrink from the encroaching human noise as if it were a physical assault. One of them, a male with hair like spun silver, looked at the cathedral's ceiling, his lips moving in a soundless prayer. The old priest, a man with kind, weary eyes, was the first to approach Celeste. He bowed his head, an act of faith that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. "My lady," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, we have waited." Celeste's expression softened, a brief flicker of warmth in the depths of her starry eyes. "And we are sorry we made you wait so long," she replied, her voice a melody of immense sadness and grace. Her words were not a direct translation of any human language Julian knew, yet he understood them perfectly, as if she was speaking directly to his soul. It was in that moment that he realized the sheer scale of the event he was witnessing. This was not a visit. It was a return. As Julian took another photo, a flash of red light appeared on the chest of the silver-haired angel. It wasn't a reflection, but a pulsating internal light that made the angel gasp, a look of profound pain crossing his face. Celeste's serene demeanor instantly shattered. She rushed to his side, her hands hovering over his chest, a look of abject fear in her eyes. "Not here," she murmured, her voice losing its melodic quality and becoming a harsh, terrified whisper. The other angels turned to the cathedral doors, their faces a mixture of fear and determination. Something was coming, something that the human world couldn't see, and it was a threat even to them. The priest and the others took a step back, but Julian, driven by a journalist's instinct for the center of the story, took a step forward, his camera ready. The doors of St. Ceres, son. Jude's cathedral were no longer grand wooden barriers, but a fragile boundary between two worlds. The sirens outside suddenly ceased, replaced by a deep, unnatural silence that felt more terrifying than any noise. The old priest, now trembling, began to whisper prayers under his breath. The red light on the silver-haired angel's chest pulsed faster, and he swayed on his feet, his celestial form seeming to shimmer and waver. Julian's focus was now solely on Celeste. Her eyes, which had held the quiet peace of the cosmos, were now filled with a desperate, frantic energy. "We are not ready," she whispered, a plea not to the humans, but to some unseen force. The other angels spread out, forming a protective semicircle around her and the ailing one, their hands glowing faintly. The cathedral's interior temperature dropped, and Julian could see his own breath. Suddenly, the great doors of the cathedral burst inward with a sound like thunder, not pushed, but demolished. Standing in the doorway was a figure who looked like an angel, but felt like the polar opposite. This was not a being of light and grace, but of cold, sharp angles and darkness. His eyes were not stars, but black holes, and his face was a mask of furious contempt. This was Sariel, and the air around him crackled with a malevolent energy that made the dust motes in the air recoil. He looked at Celeste and smiled, a chilling expression that held no warmth whatsoever. "Sister," he said, his voice a low, gravelly sound that seemed to scrape against the very foundation of the cathedral. "Did you truly think you could hide?" He was not alone. Behind him, standing in the ruined doorway, were a dozen other angels, their forms less radiant, their eyes holding a hungry, predatory gleam. They were not here to seek refuge, they were here to hunt. Julian, his heart pounding in his chest, knew this was a different kind of story altogether. He raised his camera, his finger hovering over the button. The peaceful, beautiful arrival was a lie. This was war. Celeste didn't flinch. Her hands, which had been glowing, now closed into tight fists, the light vanishing. She stepped in front of the other angels, a shield of defiance. "Sariel," she said, her voice now a sharp, cutting blade of sound. "This is not your dominion. You have no power here." Sariel laughed, a sound like grinding stone. "On the contrary, little sister. Where you go, I follow. And this world, so full of beautiful, terrified souls, is ripe for the taking. They've already welcomed your lies. How easily will they accept the truth?" He gestured to the city outside. Through the ruined doors, Julian could see people scattering in terror, their screams now muted and distant. The television news vans were ablaze with the light of unknown celestial fire, their signals replaced by a static that shrieked like a dying animal. One of Sariel's followers stepped forward, a woman whose face was a mask of cold fury. "They abandoned us," she spat, pointing a finger at Celeste. "They chose this dying world over our own." "We chose peace," Celeste replied, her voice unwavering. "You chose war." Julian, hidden in the shadows of a confessional booth, realized the truth. The angels hadn't come to save humanity. They were refugees from a civil war, and the battle had just followed them to Earth. This wasn't a visitation. It was an invasion. He had to tell someone, to warn the world. He glanced at his camera, its battery blinking a low red. He had to get out of here. But as he turned to run, Sariel's black eyes fixed on his hiding place. "And what have we here?" the dark angel murmured, his smile widening into a predatory grin. "A witness. How delightful." He took a step forward, the floorboards groaning under his weight as if in protest. The game of hide-and-seek was over. Julian knew, with a certainty that turned his blood to ice, that he was no longer an observer. He was now a participant in a war he didn't understand. Celeste moved with blinding speed, a flash of white light intersecting Sariel's path just as he reached for Julian's hiding spot. Her arm, no longer human in appearance, became a translucent shield of pure energy. "He is not your concern," she snarled, her voice losing all remnants of its former grace. It was a guttural, furious sound. Sariel scoffed, a sneer twisting his perfect features. "Everything in this world is my concern, little sister. You brought it into our war." With a flick of his wrist, he sent a jolt of dark energy ripping through the air. The shield Celeste had raised held for a moment, then fractured, the shards of pure light dissipating into the dust. The impact sent Celeste stumbling back, and for the first time Julian saw a flash of pain on her face. The other angels, the loyal ones, rushed forward to engage Sariel's followers. The cathedral, once a place of quiet contemplation, was now a battlefield of shimmering light and shadow. Julian, seeing his chance, scrambled out of the confessional and sprinted towards a side door. He needed to get out, to deliver the story. He had to show the world that this wasn't a peaceful arrival, it was a hostile takeover. He didn't make it. A sharp pain erupted in his leg, and he fell to the ground, his camera clattering across the stone floor. He looked down and saw a jagged, dark shard of what looked like obsidian embedded in his calf. It wasn't bleeding, but a cold, heavy numbness was spreading from the wound. He looked up, his eyes meeting the black voids of Sariel's. "You see?" Sariel said, his voice now a cold whisper. "The game is over." He took a slow, deliberate step toward Julian, his eyes never leaving his face. Julian knew with a terrifying clarity that he was about to become the first human casualty in a war he had only just discovered. Celeste screamed his name, a sound that tore through the chaos of the battle. She thrust out her hands, and from them burst a wave of shimmering light that slammed into Sariel. He grunted, the attack pushing him back, and he glanced at Celeste with a look of pure hatred before focusing back on Julian. But the moment of distraction was all she needed. Before Sariel could recover, the silver-haired angel, whose name Julian now heard called as Alaric, appeared in front of the journalist, his body glowing with a fierce, unstable energy. He placed a hand on Julian's shoulder, and the cold, heavy numbness in his leg was replaced by a searing pain. Then nothing. A different kind of warmth spread through him, a feeling of pure, restorative power. He looked down and saw the black shard of obsidian had vanished, the wound in his leg gone. "You must go," Alaric said, his voice a low, urgent hum. "Find others. Tell them what you have seen." Julian, though his mind was reeling from the impossible healing, didn't hesitate. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing his camera as he went. Alaric turned to face Sariel, a look of grim determination on his face. The dark angel sneered. "A healer? How pathetic! You'll die for him, won't you?" "We all die," Alaric said, his hands glowing with a soft, warm light. "But some of us die for a reason." As Alaric engaged Sariel, Julian, with the last of his strength, sprinted for the door. He didn't look back. He ran out of the cathedral and into the chaotic, terrified streets of Etheria. He had the photos, the proof, but he also had something more, a message. He knew that the war had just begun, and the fate of both worlds rested on a group of tired, desperate angels and one cynical journalist. He had to make sure the world heard their story before it was too late. Julian stumbled through the panicked streets of Etheria, a ghost in a storm of human chaos. The city was a canvas of terror. Cars were abandoned in the middle of the road, their horns blaring in a cacophony of futility. People ran in every direction, their faces twisted in primal fear, and everywhere a strange, dark, inky energy seemed to pulse in the air, a residue of Sariel's presence. Julian's mind, usually a fortress of logic and skepticism, struggled to process what he had seen. The impossible healing, the war, the simple, heart-breaking sorrow in Celeste's eyes. It was all too real. He had to get to his office. He had to upload the photos, to write the story. He had to be the one to tell the world the truth, before it was irrevocably changed by Sariel's lies. As he dodged a speeding police car, he saw a flickering image on a giant digital billboard that normally showed financial news. It was Sariel, his face a chilling mask of calm authority. "Do not be afraid," he was saying, his voice broadcast through every available channel. "We have come to bring order to your chaos, to bring peace where there has been only discord. These false angels, led by the one you call Celeste, are the true enemy. They would see this world burn rather than see it saved." Julian's blood ran cold. The misdirection, the lie he had seen hinted at in the cathedral, was now being fed to the entire world, a grand, deceptive narrative. The public, already terrified and looking for a savior, was being handed one on a silver platter. He glanced down at his camera, its memory card holding the real story, the truth that could turn the tide. He knew then that this wasn't just about a good headline. It was about a fight for the soul of humanity, a fight that had just begun. He ran faster, pushing through the terrified crowds, every step a desperate act of defiance against a lie that was already taking hold. Julian finally reached the towering steel and glass building that housed the Etheria Tribune. The lobby was a ghost town, the usual hustle replaced by a chilling stillness. The receptionist's desk was empty, a half-eaten sandwich and a steaming cup of coffee, a silent testament to the speed of the evacuation. He raced to the elevator, his heart pounding in his ears, and punched the button for his floor. The ride up felt like an eternity. When the doors opened, the newsroom was a scene of controlled chaos. A handful of reporters and editors were glued to their screens, their faces illuminated by the flickering images of Sariel's broadcast. Julian's editor-in-chief, a grizzled veteran named Helen, was screaming into a phone, her face ashen. She saw Julian, and her eyes widened in a mixture of relief and fury. "Julian! Where the hell have you been? We've been trying to reach you," she shouted, hanging up the phone with a violent slam. Julian didn't answer. He rushed to his desk, ignoring the questions being fired at him, and plunged the memory card from his camera into his computer. He pulled up the images, the descent of Celeste and her followers, the peaceful, sorrowful look on her face, and then the dark, malevolent arrival of Sariel. The shattered doors of the cathedral, the fire in Sariel's eyes, and the final, frantic struggle of Celeste as she defended him. The truth was all there, a raw, unfiltered visual record of the events. Helen rushed to his desk and saw the photos on his screen. The color drained from her face. "Julian, what? What is this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Julian looked her in the eye, the full weight of the story resting on his shoulders. "This is the real story, Helen. Sariel, the one on the broadcast. He's a fraud. The angels aren't here to save us. They're at war, and the first battle just happened in St. Jude's. He's lying to the world, and we have to tell them the truth." Helen stared at the photos, the conflict between what she was seeing and what the world was being told, playing out on her face. Julian knew this was the moment of truth. The fate of the world would be decided not on a battlefield of light and shadow, but in a chaotic newsroom, in a race against a lie. Helen didn't waver for long. The photos told a story more compelling than any political rhetoric. "Get to work, Julian," she said, her voice filled with a renewed sense of purpose. "Write everything down. Every detail, every word they said. We're going live in 10 minutes. Julian's fingers flew across the keyboard, the story pouring out of him. He wrote about the silence in the cathedral, the sorrow in Celeste's eyes, the terrifying grace of her descent. He wrote about the black-eyed fury of Sariel, the shard of darkness, and the impossible warm light of Alaric's healing touch. He wove the truth into a narrative that exposed Sariel's broadcast as a lie, a carefully constructed piece of propaganda. He included the photos, the irrefutable evidence of a celestial war that had just spilled onto Earth. As he worked, a news producer ran up to his desk, her eyes wide with fear. "Helen, we have a problem. All our satellite feeds are being jammed. We can't broadcast." A cold dread settled in Julian's stomach. Sariel wasn't just a powerful warrior. He was a master manipulator, controlling the very flow of information. He was cutting them off, silencing the one voice that could speak the truth. Helen's face tightened with grim determination. "Then we'll find another way," she said, pulling a laptop from her bag. "Julian, send me the file. We'll broadcast it on the dark web. It might not reach everyone, but it will reach someone who can help." Julian nodded, the gravity of their plan settling in his gut. This was no longer just a story, it was an act of rebellion. They were going to fight a god with a keyboard and an internet connection. He watched as Helen began to work, her hands a blur on the keys. They were not alone in this fight, and he had a feeling that somewhere in the chaotic, terrified city, other people were starting to realize the truth too. Julian watched Helen's fingers fly, her face illuminated by the harsh glow of the laptop screen. He had never seen his editor-in-chief like this, not in all her years of gruff and cynical leadership. She was a warrior in her own right, fighting for the truth with the only weapons they had left. The file, a meticulously compiled narrative of photos and text, was now a digital time bomb waiting to be detonated. The fate of Etheria, and perhaps the world, rested on this single act of defiance. Just as Helen was about to hit upload, the screen flickered, then went black. The lights in the newsroom died, plunging the floor into a sudden, suffocating darkness. The only light now came from the street below, a frantic, chaotic dance of car headlights. A cold voice, a low and terrible whisper, echoed through the darkness, not from a speaker, but from the very air around them. "Did you truly think I would not see you?" Julian and Helen looked up, their hearts pounding in their chests. In the doorway of the newsroom, framed by the faint light from the hall, stood Sariel. He was alone, his face a mask of furious disappointment. He had not come for a war, he had come for a message. He had come for them. "Your truth is a nuisance," he said, his voice a razor's edge, "but it is easily forgotten." He raised his hand, a shard of pure shadow forming in his palm, and he looked at Julian with an expression of cold, predatory interest. "I have heard of your kind, storytellers, the most dangerous of all." Julian felt a profound, chilling sense of finality. He was staring into the face of a being who had just declared war on the very concept of truth. He and Helen were not just journalists, they were the last holdouts of a dying world, and their stories were the last words it might ever hear. There was no escape. This was it. The story had come full circle, and Julian, the observer, was now the protagonist in a final, deadly scene. Suddenly, a brilliant, warm light flooded the newsroom, shattering the inky darkness. Sariel recoiled, his shadow shard dissipating into nothingness with a hiss. In the doorway where he had stood a moment ago, Celeste now appeared, her form radiating a gentle, protective glow. "Leave them be, Sariel," she commanded, her voice no longer a melodic whisper, but a resonant bell that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Sariel sneered, his eyes filled with venomous rage. "You are weak, Celeste, to abandon your true form for these fragile things. You will not save them." "I am not abandoning anything," Celeste replied, her gaze unwavering. "I am learning something you could not." With a roar of fury, Sariel lunged forward, but not at Celeste. He moved to the server room, his intention clear, to destroy the heart of their information network, to ensure the truth could never get out. Julian, his body moving on instinct, ran to a fire extinguisher and sprayed its contents directly at Sariel. The foam, a mundane earthly substance, had no effect on the Dark Angel, but it did distract him for a crucial second. That was all Celeste needed. She surged past Julian, her body becoming a blur of pure light, and intercepted Sariel just as he was about to rip open the server door. The collision was a silent explosion of energy that sent a shock wave through the building, shattering windows and toppling furniture. Julian and Helen were thrown to the floor. When Julian looked up, the two angels were locked in a silent, desperate struggle. Celeste was trying to contain him, her hands glowing as she held Sariel's arms, but the Dark Angel was stronger, his power crackling with a destructive, chaotic force. As they fought, a tiny, fragile red light began to pulse again on Celeste's chest, a mirror of the one Julian had seen on Alaric. She was being drained, her strength fading with every passing moment. Julian knew, with a terrible sense of certainty, that he was witnessing the final act of this celestial war, and one of them was not going to walk away from it. Celeste was failing. The pulse of red light on her chest was growing faster, a frantic beat that mirrored her fading life force. Sariel, on the other hand, was growing stronger, a dark tendril of energy coiling around his hand and snaking toward the server racks. He was going to win, and the world would be plunged into a dark age of his choosing. Julian, watching the two angels, realized with a cold, hard clarity that he had been wrong. This was not a war of power. It was a war of belief. Sariel's strength came from the fear and chaos he was sowing, Celeste's from something else entirely. He looked at Helen, who was just beginning to stir on the floor, and an idea, insane and desperate, sparked in his mind. "The camera!" he shouted over the cacophony of the fight. "Helen, the camera!" Helen's eyes were still dazed, but she understood. She crawled across the floor, retrieved Julian's camera, and handed it to him. He grabbed it, his hands trembling, and began to scroll through the photos, finding the first image he had ever taken of Celeste in the cathedral. Her face was serene, but her eyes held a profound sadness. It was a picture not of a god, but of a broken, grieving being. Julian knew what he had to do. With the last of his strength, he raised the camera, and with a flash of light, he projected the image onto the largest screen in the newsroom. It was not a violent, chaotic scene, but one of quiet, heartbreaking beauty. The image was a counter-narrative, a single, undeniable piece of truth. He looked at Celeste and shouted, "We believe you!" Celeste's fading eyes met his, and for a fleeting moment, a spark of hope ignited within them. The red light on her chest slowed, its beat becoming steady and strong again. She looked at Julian, at the screen, at the small, defiant act of a human who refused to accept a lie. A look of fierce determination crossed her face. The war was not over, but for the first time, Julian knew they had a chance. The image Julian had projected onto the newsroom screen was a small but crucial victory. Sariel, for all his power, was a creature of darkness and lies. He fed on fear and deception, and the image of Celeste's quiet, heartbreaking sadness was a truth he could not comprehend, much less combat. He roared in frustration, a sound of pure, impotent rage. The dark tendril of energy that was snaking towards the servers dissipated into nothingness. "You cannot win," Sariel snarled at Julian. "Your fragile beliefs are no match for my power." But he was wrong. Julian's belief wasn't fragile. It was an act of stubborn defiance, the very thing that made humanity so unpredictable. Celeste, emboldened by this small human act of faith, seemed to find a new wellspring of strength. She stopped trying to contain Sariel, and instead began to channel her own energy, a warm, golden light that was the very antithesis of his darkness. It was not a weapon, but a force of life, a counterpoint to his destructive power. As Celeste's light grew brighter, the chaotic dark energy that was swirling around Sariel began to recede. His form, once a figure of perfect menace, began to waver, his edges blurring. He looked at Celeste with a look of dawning horror. "What have you done?" he screamed, his voice no longer a thunderous roar but a desperate, terrified shriek. "I have done what you could not," Celeste replied, her voice now steady and strong. "I have embraced the truth that power is not in the sword, but in the heart." The light from her swelled, engulfing Sariel entirely. He screamed again, a sound of pure terror, as his form dissolved into motes of shimmering shadow swallowed by the light. And then there was only silence. Julian, watching the spectacle with a mixture of awe and disbelief, knew that the celestial war had just ended. But the real work, he knew, was only just beginning. The brilliant light faded, leaving behind only the dim glow of the city's power grid, which had sputtered back to life. The newsroom, once a battlefield, was now a silent tableau of shattered glass and upturned furniture. Sariel was gone, his final desperate screams echoing only in Julian's mind. Celeste stood in the center of the room, no longer glowing, but still radiating a quiet, profound peace. The red light on her chest was gone, replaced by a single pulsing star of pure energy, a final, beautiful testament to her victory. She looked to Julian and Helen, a small, grateful smile on her face. "It is over," she said, her voice now a soft, melodic whisper. "You have saved us all." But Julian knew it wasn't true. It was Celeste who had won the war, not them. They had only provided the spark. He looked at her, at the quiet, lonely figure who had sacrificed her divine power for a world she barely knew. The celestial war was over, but the work of integrating two worlds had just begun. The lies Sariel had sown would not disappear with him. They would have to be unraveled, and the truth would have to be built one story at a time. Celeste, as if reading his thoughts, walked over to him. She reached out and took his hand, her touch no longer a source of immense power, but a simple, warm, human gesture. "The battle is over," she said, her eyes meeting his. "But the story is just beginning. Now you must tell it." She looked around the broken newsroom, at the laptop and the cameras, at the tools of his trade. Julian understood. His job wasn't to simply report on the news. It was to help write the next chapter of history, a chapter of hope and reconciliation between two worlds. The war had ended, but their journey had just begun, a quiet, human story in the ruins of a celestial conflict. He looked at Helen, a silent agreement passing between them. With the world watching, they had a story to tell.